Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast with former Texas offensive coordinator Greg Davis, part 1, is brought to you in part by Compassion International. We are so thankful for Compassion for being sponsors of the Sports Spectrum podcast. And listen, they do it right. If you're ever wondering how you can make a difference in a child's life, how can you impact a child, directly impact them? Compassion is the place. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum. Here's your chance for $38 a month to sponsor a child. Every child being discipled in the Word of God. Over 150,000 children choosing to follow Jesus Christ in the last year alone through the great work at Compassion International. You can make a difference. What to do, who to trust. That's what we always are asking, wondering when we're giving our money away. Compassion, you can trust them. I promise you that. I personally encourage you to sponsor with Compassion. You will not regret $38 a month. The most trusted child development ministry in the world. Sponsor a child today. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum. I promise you, you won't regret it. Today's guest on the podcast is Greg Davis, former college football coach. He was with Texas as their offensive coordinator and QB coach from 1998 to 2010. He was a member of that national championship team that won it all back in 2005, beating USC in that famous Rose Bowl game. They averaged 50.2 points per game that year. That was an NCAA record back in 2005, and Greg Davis had a lot to do with it. And on this podcast, we're going to bring you part 1. We're going to break it up into 2 parts. And part 1 of our conversation with Greg Davis will center around retirement. He retired in January of 2017 from coaching. He began his coaching career a long time ago, coached for many years, and probably, again, most notably with Texas, but then left Texas in 2010 and returned to coaching in 2012 at the University of Iowa, where he was there as their offensive coordinator and quarterback coach for 5 seasons. He retired, like I said, in 2017. He also had stints at North Carolina, Georgia, Arkansas, Tulane, and Texas A&M. He was named the Frank Broyles Assistant Coach of the Year in 2005, that Texas Longhorn National Championship season. So let's get right to it, because you'll like this podcast because it's coaching 101 in a lot of ways. We don't have a ton of coaches here on the podcast. We do have some, and Greg Davis is one who sort of aligns with what we are about, not only from coaching perspective, but from a faith perspective. He loves Jesus, and we talk about what he misses about coaching, why he stepped away, how retirement's been for him, and how he sort of integrates his faith into his coaching, or how he integrated his faith into his coaching. It's a poignant conversation. That's why we broke it up into 2 parts, because it was so good we didn't want to cut any of it out. So here is part 1 of our conversation with former Texas offensive coordinator Greg Davis right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Coach Davis, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'll start off right off the bat by saying how much I enjoyed your time when you and your brother came down to Colleyville and spoke at Compass Church. It was a lot of fun, and it was very moving. So thank you for what you do.
Coach, thank you very much. Yeah, we were down there, my brother and I, back in late May, talking about my book, Live to Forgive, and it was great to meet you in person and really started the conversation that's led to this interview. So very excited to have you on the podcast. The first thing I wrote down on my paper here in my prep for our interview was January 6, 2017. And that's the day, I'm sure you know, that you retired from college football. And we'll get into your journey in a minute, but tell me how retirement's been going for you. You're about a year and a half into the retirement life. How's that been treating you?
Well, it's not as bad as people want to tell you, Jason. I tell you,
yeah.
Every day's Saturday. And it's the first thing I found when the season started is that stores were actually open on Saturday. I did not know that.
Yep.
The second thing was for 43 years on Saturday during the season, I woke up with, just a little bit of throw up in my mouth, and I didn't have that anymore. So So it was good. I totally enjoyed my time. I did it for 43 years. My wife is a saint. It gave me a platform that I tried to honor. But it was time for me. It was time for me to totally devote myself to my family and my grandkids, and so we've totally enjoyed it.
What was or what has life been like with your wife seeing you every day? Is she kind of kicking you out of the house sometimes and saying, "Come on, coach, get out of here. I'm used to you being away."
Yeah. You sound like you have a similar wife. So, we. I do a little counseling work or consulting with the University of Houston. Major Applewhite, the head coach there, was a player for me at Texas, and so I spent some time during the season down there, mainly just visiting with him. And ever so often, my wife Patsy will say, "When are you going back to Houston? Isn't it about time?" So there's some getting to know each other again when you retire after a business like coaching.
I have to imagine. Now, just on the level of being a coach, do you miss it?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
When people ask, and since I was, probably 6 years old, Jason, I've been part of a team. Either Little League baseball, all the way through college and then coaching, and we were always pulling in the same direction and for the same goals and working. And all of a sudden, you don't have that, and that's what I miss. I miss the 5-year journey of watching a freshman come in and not sure, and he's half man, half boy, and 5 years later, he's pretty much man, and you've had a little something to do with that. And, I miss that. I don't miss junior days. I don't miss recruiting in some of the camps, but I do miss being a part of a team.
What do you think you learned about yourself just in the past year and a half since leaving coaching? What have you learned most about yourself?
Well, very insignificantly, I've learned that I can do some things around the house. Google is an amazing tool, and so some of the things that my wife said, "Oh, Greg can't do that. He never would do that." I've actually been able to do some of those things. The second thing is really we've moved back. To Colleyville, right outside of Dallas, because my daughter and son-in-law live here, and they're 3 children. So, reconnecting with the grandkids, and I saw my youngest one baptized about 2 months ago. That completes all 5 of my grandchildren.
Right.
And that's been the greatest thing.
We're talking to Greg Davis here, former college football coach on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Coaching is such a tricky profession for people of faith, in my opinion. Maybe it's not, because you don't want to alienate the team based upon those that are followers of Christ and those that aren't, of course. What have you learned over these years that has helped you as you've lived out your faith through your job as a coach, but also understanding that every person's journey is different and every person's faith in many ways sometimes is different?
That is a great question. It's a great question because I mentioned earlier, you do have a platform. Yeah. You want to use it, but at the same time, you have to be cognizant of you're in a public university. Or I was, and not everybody believes like you do. Some people get, very offended. So what I tried to do was every team I was on for 43 years, we had chapel services. So I can't swear to you that I'd never missed one, but I bet I did miss a handful in 43 years. And so So by being there, I think I let the guys know that we're there, that I was a believer. Also let them know, hey, if there's anybody on the team or if they need to talk, I'd certainly be glad to. Anytime those chapel services needed a coach to speak at, I tried to make myself available. I thought that was another way to let people know. And then, I guess the other thing, Jason, is just, trying to walk in such a way that that the guys know, okay, this guy's a little bit different in some of, and and sometimes that can be a challenge.
Yeah.
And then the other things is that there's things that come up during football season. Fortunately, we were always playing after Christmas. So, when we would break for Christmas and I would be, addressing the offense for the last time. Okay, guys, we, drive safe. Here's when you're going to be back, hug your parents. And somewhere along the next 2 or 3 days, try to reflect on what Christmas is all about. So, you could kind of try to slide things like that in. But it is a little bit of a balancing act. You're exactly right. And you certainly don't want to alienate anybody because they feel differently than you do.
Of course. And I wonder for you how many instances or opportunities you've had to actually, by doing that, had these sort of deeper, below the surface level conversations with some players about that world, about faith, about just exploring it and who Jesus is, maybe to you. Like, have you had those conversations? Obviously, we don't want to name any names because it's such a personal thing, but have you had those kind of conversations?
Yes. And doing what we just mentioned, has led guys to be able to come in and shut the door and say, hey, coach, you got 5 minutes. And I'm sure we got 5 minutes. And, can I trust you? And you're not going to, yeah, sure. I mean, what do you want to talk about? So, yeah, there's been, there's been several of those. And some, just so that the audience understand, some of them are not, this guy that walked in that was full of demons. Some are guys that are, hey, I just need to, I am a Christian coach, but I'm struggling in college. I'm by myself. My parents, I come in when I want to, girls kind of like me. So there's a full spectrum there, from the non-believer to the believer that's off from home for the first time and it's experiencing college and life.
You coached for 43 years, you said. Is there a difference in how you treated, handled, talked to, coached a kid when you first came in versus certainly when you left, a couple of years ago? Did you see a big difference in how these kids sort of evolved, or were there pretty much the same kind of traits and personalities and issues and things that you had to work through?
I think all of the above. Quite honestly, by the time I retired, our playbook was on an iPad. When I first started, our playbook was stenciled in the field house, and and run off on one of those. And half of your audience, 2/3 of your audience, may not even know what I'm talking about. So that's the difference. The way you could communicate. I mean, when I first started, you couldn't film every practice. We didn't have the budget to film every practice. We didn't have the availability to take the film and get it processed. And now there is no film, obviously. I mean, by the time I can get back to my office after a ball game, the film's ready to go or the tape is ready to go. By the time I get on a plane, video coordinator hands me an iPad with the game. Said, Coach, you can watch it on the flight home. So from those standpoints, huge difference from when I started. From the kids, the basis of coaching, Jason, is teaching. And so I don't think not a great change there in what you had to do, and that they wanted structure. They really did. They wanted discipline. They really did. And I think that from, my first job in 1973 all the way, through the end. The way you go about it was a little different also, though. I mean, when I came through, and I'm older than you, but when I came through, if I came home and said, Dad, Coach wanted me to do, well, okay, let's do it. I mean, so that part's changed a little bit. And there's some questions. Parents are, not to give the impression my dad wasn't involved, because having heard your story, my dad was much different. He was the best man at my wedding. And so
Yeah.
he was involved, but he certainly didn't have an opinion on what the coach was doing. It was right. And so, so there's been, there's been tremendous changes in technology and some of the things, but I really think the basis of dealing with kids is pretty close to what it was.
There's so many coaches out there, especially many of them listening to this podcast. I know high school coaches, even Little League coaches, that want to get better at what they do. So for you, encourage them. You're somebody who's coached for a long time. Encourage them and share maybe a few of the things that you found worked best for you in connecting with the teams that you coached on.
I think everybody has to, I'm asked at clinics and various functions. I think everybody has to coach within their own personality. I really do. I think a player at every level doesn't really care what you know until he knows that you care. And that is not a Greg Davisism. That is, coaches have used that, but it is so true. I think I broke through with Vince Young. Vince went to a predominantly black school in Houston. I don't even know if they had a white coach. He certainly didn't have a white coach that worked with him. He came to the University of Texas, and I'm not sure I got through to him until he had his appendix out. And when he had his appendix out, I went to the hospital, and his mom was there, and she was exhausted. And I said, why don't you go get some sleep, and I'll stay with Vince. And it was nothing special, Jason. I mean, I certainly don't deserve a medal for that, but it allowed Vince and his mom to say, he cares. It's not just what he can do on the football field. So back to the question, I think they have to know that you care, and then I have to, you have to be an encourager. I heard, I can't even remember, but one of the original Pro Bowlers, I think maybe his name was Dick Weber. I heard one of his tapes one time, because I've always been into motivational tapes, and they said, "Well, Dick, you had an advantage on everybody. You were bowling. Your dad owned a bowling alley. Tell us about it." And he said, "My dad was brilliant." And they said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah. When I started bowling at 5, he stuffed the gutters. I never threw the ball in the gutter. It always bounced back and hit some pins." Well, God bless his dad. You got to encourage. I think Little League football needs to play with little footballs. Their hands are not ready to play, to play with the big football. I think coaches of Little League football, you should teach fundamentals and you should be an encourager. And gosh, if you win, that's fine. If you don't, that's okay too. But let them have a good time and feel better about themselves at the end of the season than they did at the start.
That's good advice. Now, the word culture, Coach, is used a lot in the context of coaching in teams. I hear it a lot in different leadership books that I read. It's such a common sort of buzzword, culture. What does that mean to you when you have a quote unquote great culture? And then on the other side, when you have a toxic culture, which maybe you've never been a part of, and I'm sure many of us have, just if you live life you have, but many just equate it to wins and losses. If you win, great culture. If you lose, it's toxic. What do you think on that, and about how culture works in the dynamic of team?
I think it's huge. I think leadership, culture, your veteran leaders, however you want to phrase it, but culture is a very cliche term now.
Yeah.
And I certainly understand what they're talking about. And to me, they're talking about a group of men, boys, kids. They're talking about a business. They're talking about a bank. They're talking about whatever, all pulling in the same direction. And so in athletics, it's, in most cases, it's fairly easy to get it. I mean, to get somewhat of guys pulling in that direction, because they don't normally get to college football unless they've done that. But still, I mean, egos can be a factor. I mean, who's getting all the print and who's the preseason All-American, and that can be a factor that has to be attained. The defense, gets all the praise, the offense gets all the criticism, or vice versa, or that can cause problems. People that are not, people in the weight room that are not tied in to the head coach's theory can help create a bad culture, and not even intentionally, not even trying to sabotage the culture. Just but it's real. I mean, it's real. It's hard to define, and the when you hear it the most is a new guy takes over State University, and his first time that someone runs up and sticks a microphone in his mouth. Well, we're trying to change the culture.
Yeah.
I mean, it invariably. And I think what he's saying is we're trying to get everybody pulling in the same direction. We're trying to get the nutritionists, the academic people. We're trying to get the trainers. We're trying to get everybody preaching one message and pulling in the same direction. And then if you're fortunate enough to have a little success, it continues.
Right. It makes the word culture become a great culture,
Right.
Especially when you're winning.
Right.
We're talking to Coach Greg Davis here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Coach, was that something you always wanted to be known as? Coaching, you did it for 43 years. When did you first find out or realize or kind of get that itch that you thought coaching might be something you wanted to get into?
Well, I was fortunate. I had great youth coaches, great high school coaches, and you could walk by our coaches' offices in high school, and there was always laughter coming out, and they were always, I thought, wow, I mean, these guys are getting paid. I mean, they wear shorts to work,
Yeah.
and they get to run around there with us, and it seems like they're having fun. And then, then I went to college, and I was going to be a lawyer, and then they said something about, you had to have all these hours of foreign language. And I said, oh, okay, well, if I'm not going to coach in Mexico, I probably can do without that. And but I wanted to be honest, because of guys that coached me. I mean, they really did seem to be enjoying what they were like, and I was further fortunate. My dad owned an insurance business in a small town. We grew up in Groves, Texas, population 16,000. Mm-hmm. And so I was the oldest of 4 children, and there's no doubt he wanted me to take over, or certainly one of his boys, unless his daughter would have. And, and so I walked in one day to his office and said, Dad, I've decided I'm going to be a coach. And he said, are you sure? Is that what you want? Yeah. And he said, well, go be the best damn coach you can be. Mm-hmm. And but it's been a blessing. It really has. It's hard to explain. My wife, again, who I talked about earlier, when we won the national championship in 2005, Mac had set it up that if we were fortunate enough to win, that he wanted the wives on the field, and then he wanted the wives to have access to the dressing room, after his talk and get to see the kids, etc. And so I had talked to my wife. I said, what is it? And I said, it's a high. It's a high that you can't explain. And I don't know where you get it in the real world. I don't know where you get that feeling after a win. And so after the national championship, and they got down on the field, and then they went in the tunnel with us, and then they went in the dressing room as Mac addressed the team. And then they went outside as everybody started getting dressed, et cetera. And so when I got to the bus after the ball game, my wife, Patsy, said, I see it now. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, it's unbelievable. That dressing room is unbelievable. Now, obviously, when we lost to Alabama 4 years later, that dressing room wasn't unbelievable. And so the highs and the lows of the business and is hard to explain to people. I know everybody that goes to a game thinks they could coach, and but there's so much more to it than what they see on Saturday. So when kids ask me, I'll wrap that portion up. Sometimes you ask me a question, I go on forever.
That's okay. This is a podcast. We can tell stories all day.
Kids come in sometimes. They say, Coach, I'm thinking about coaching. I say, okay, let's talk about that. And I said, well, what you see is, I'm coaching at a university, and you come over to the house for burgers, and I have a nice home, and, it's not always like that. First of all, not everybody gets to coach in college. And I said, and you got to be married to a woman. And, we coached at 7 different universities. And that's not even a huge number for some people. And that's 7 different moves. It takes a toll on your family. And but if you can live without it, you should. If you can't, it's the greatest business in the world.
That's former Texas offensive coordinator Greg Davis here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. That was part 1. We will be releasing part 2 of our conversation with Greg coming up tomorrow. So basically, if you're listening to this after it releases, you probably are able to listen to both episodes back to back. But we are releasing this the next day, the day after we release part 1. We will be releasing part 2 of our conversation with former Texas offensive coordinator Greg Davis here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Thank you for listening to part 1 of our conversation here on the podcast. We also want to thank our sponsors, Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum, $38 a month. Sponsor a child. I promise you, you're going to provide them with hope. You're going to provide them with food, shelter, education, tutoring, all of the things that children should have, the things that we just take for granted here in the United States for so many of us. This is what Compassion does. They take your money and they go and have it directly impact to a child. You get to go to the website, compassion.com/sportspectrum, and you can pray about it and then select the child that you want to sponsor, and then you directly impact them with your money every single month. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum, sponsor a child today. Thanks so much for listening to part 1 of our conversation with Greg Davis here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Stay tuned for part 2 coming up tomorrow. As always, you can reach us on the web at sportspectrum.com, and you can email me directly, jason@sportspectrum.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.